Good morning. The readings you've just heard provide an outline of what I want to share with you today. The first reading is the first point that I want to cover, that the country has worked very hard to hide a shameful period of our history. The second point is that history matters. That period of hidden history has had an outsized impact on our society. We need to understand and own our history and use it to inform how we work to make our country a place where all can have the opportunity to prosper. Of course, the period of history I'm highlighting is the Jim Crow era, from the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s to the middle of the 20th century. The era of lynching and terror has never been researched in detail until just a few years ago. In 2017, the Equal Justice Initiative, based in Montgomery, Alabama, published this report. Got it here. It's called Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. It's available online. You can download it for free. The report chronicles the history by compiling results of detailed investigations and by highlighting the specific incidents that have largely been forgotten. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the Equal Justice Initiative. EJI was founded in 1989 by Brian Stevenson, a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer and best-selling author of Just Mercy. That's a wonderful book. EJI is a nonprofit that provides legal representation to people who have been illegally convicted, unfairly sentenced, or abused in state jails and prisons. They challenge the death penalty and excessive punishment and provide reentry assistance to formerly incarcerated people. In 2018, EJI opened the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And this was part of their national effort to create new spaces, markers, and memorials that address the legacy of slavery, lynching, and racial segregation, which shapes many issues today. Another source that I used with a wider scope is a recently published Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. So I've got that book here if you want to look at it later. So this book has a compilation of essays, poems, which the Greenwood reading that Maggie did was from the 1619 Project. From the 400-year history of African Americans in North America. The EJI report researched racial terror lynching. And now the report distinguishes these lynchings from hangings and mob violence that followed some criminal trials or committed against non-minorities without that threat of terror. Those deaths were a crude form of punishment that did not have the features of terror lynchings directed at racial minorities who were being threatened or menaced in many ways. They also distinguish terror lynching from racial violence and hate crimes that were prosecuted as criminal acts. Such prosecutions were rare, but they did serve to provide some deterrence impact. The lynchings documented by EJI are acts of terrorism because these murders were carried out with impunity, sometimes in broad daylight, often on the courthouse lawn. These acts were not frontier justice because they took place in communities with functioning criminal justice systems that were deemed too good for African Americans. Terror lynchings were horrific acts of violence whose perpetrators were never held accountable. Public spectacle lynchings were attended by the entire white community and were celebrated as a means of racial control and domination. I know this will be difficult to listen to, but here is just one story of a public spectacle lynching that was documented in the EJI report. So I've quoted from that report. In 1904, after Luther Holbert allegedly killed a white landowner, he and a black woman believed to be his wife were captured by a mob and taken to Doddsville, Mississippi, to be lynched in front of hundreds of white spectators. Both victims were tied to a tree and forced to hold out their hands while members of the mob methodically chopped off their fingers and distributed them as souvenirs. Next, their ears were cut off. Mr. Holbert was beaten so severely that his skull was fractured and one of his eyes was left hanging from its socket. End quote. And it gets worse, but I'll spare you additional details. Another account in the 1619 project is horrific in another way. In an essay entitled Inheritance, Tremaine Lee presents the tragic story of Lamore Bowling and his family. Bowling was from a small town in Alabama who had built a successful business. He had learned from his father and grandfather how to navigate Jim Crow laws in Alabama to make a living for his wife and 7 kids. He learned never to purchase land because if a white person claimed that land was theirs, the black owner would lose. So Bowling leased his land to farm, and that grew his business by transporting livestock and feed. He purchased Model Ts and eventually semi-trucks and trailers. He also operated a very prosperous general store. He made education a priority for his kids, even though he was uneducated himself. Also, he had as many as 40 people, all black, working for him at the peak of his business. The general store added a gasoline pump to boost their business. Then one day in 1947, a white man came into the store looking for Lamore. Willie Dees, Lamore's 12-year-old son, knew this meant trouble and was terrified. Lamore was just returning from Montgomery, where his oldest kids were attending high school. While Willie watched as he saw a car trailing his father's truck when his father returned to town. As Elmore got out of his truck to make some deliveries, the white men opened fire and shot Elmore 6 times with a pistol and once in the back with a shotgun. Elmore's business expansion with the gas pump was the apparent invisible line that was crossed by Bowling's business. The shooting was carried out in the open in broad daylight with impunity. The shooting was catastrophic for the family in so many ways. Financially, the business, the families, and the family savings totaling about $500,000 in today's dollars was lost. Creditors claimed that they were owed money, and Brenda May, Lamore's widow, did not dare question any claim. The black employees returned to work as sharecroppers. The Bowling children could no longer afford to pursue their education. Only the youngest daughter was able to graduate from college. Willie D., who had been the heir apparent of the business because of his mechanical aptitude, could never live up to his potential after that day. I'm sure today's diagnosis would be PTSD. Try to imagine what a blow this attack would have been to the black community in Alabama. Clearly, this was the goal of the attack. Tremaine Lee makes the point that, quote, the fate suffered by Lamore Bowling and his family was not unique to them or to Jim Crow, Alabama. It was part of a broader social and political campaign to violently safeguard the racial hierarchy that had begun as a reaction to Reconstruction and would stretch over the next century, end quote. The EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative report investigation, provides the details that demonstrate the scope of the terror. Here are their key findings. Racial terror lynching was much more prevalent than previously reported. More than 4,000 incidents were documented in the 12 southern states studied between 1877 and 1950. Racial terror lynching was a tool used to enforce Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. In many cases, the victims were murdered without being charged with any crime. They were killed for minor social transgressions or for demanding basic rights and fair treatment. EJI's interviews with surviving family members indicate that the terror campaign led to the migration of thousands of Black families to northern states. In all the states investigated, there is an astonishing absence of any efforts to acknowledge, discuss, or address lynching. This contrasts with the great lengths communities where lynching took place go to place markers that memorialize Civil War, the Confederacy, and historic events where people, where power was reclaimed by white Southerners. The EJI report has found that terror lynching is associated with one or more of the following: a wildly distorted fear of interracial sex, responses to casual social transgressions, allegations of serious violent crime, public spectacle lynching, lynching events that escalated into widespread violence targeting African American communities, lynching of sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted mistreatment. These were the most common between 1915 and 1940. And finally, their last point, they found that the decline of lynching in the southern states correspond to the increased use of capital punishment following an accelerated trial. Public executions to mollify the mob were still held after lynching was legally banned, which indicates the direct link between the legacy of lynching and capital punishment. The legacy of racial terror lynching is psychologically damaging to both the African American and white populations. For African Americans, the traumatic experience of surviving mass violence creates insecurity, distrust, and disconnection from people. These are psychological harms that were amplified by the daily stress of navigating daily encounters with whites. The legacy for white perpetrators and witnesses is diminished empathy for victims that extends beyond the original group of victims, creating a culture of violence. Now I'm going to pivot to the message of the second reading, the Brene Brown reading about the dehumanization. The legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and racial terror lynching were enabled by the dehumanization of African Americans. The legacy of that dehumanization is at the core of systemic racism that haunts our country today. Mass incarceration, racially biased policing, and inequalities in education, household wealth, and economic opportunity all have their roots in our history. Why does this history matter? Do we just need to understand it to bear it like a cross as an original sin of our country? Do we all need to feel guilty that this shameful period took place in our country where our founding principles are freedom and justice? I say no to both. We need to understand our history because the dehumanization of people of color is still alive today. We need to understand our history as a lens to clearly see history repeat itself. And I'm talking about the rollback of voting rights in the majority of states, censoring public education to whitewash history, racially biased policing, mass incarceration, demonization of immigrants, inequality with respect to access to quality public education, clean water to drink and air to breathe, and economic opportunities. As a nation, how can we credibly criticize China and Myanmar for their treatment of ethnic minorities when we haven't cleaned up our own act? We need to own our history. We need to memorialize those victims. We need to teach our children and grandchildren about our history with unblinking eyes and without equivocation. In the words of the EJI report, education must be accompanied by acts of reconciliation, which are needed to create communities where devastating acts of racial bigotry and legacies of racial injustice can be overcome. So I want to end today with a short vignette from Bryan Stevenson. As I mentioned, he's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and this was part of his brief but spectacular piece from a PBS NewsHour. So in Bryan Stevenson's word, I was doing a hearing in the Midwest. I had my suit and tie on, and I was there early. It was the first time I had been in that courtroom. And I sat down at defense counsel table, as I always do. And the judge walked in. And the judge said, hey, you get back out there. And you wait out there in the hallway until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing and the prosecutor started laughing. And I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. But afterward, I was thinking, what is it that when the judge saw a middle-aged Black man, it didn't even occur to him that that man was sitting at defense counsel's table, was the lawyer? I worry about that judge. I worry that he's sentencing defendants of color more harshly. I worry that he doesn't value and accept the testimony of Black and brown witnesses the way he does other people. I worry that a narrative of a racial difference compromises his ability to provide fair and just treatment of all people. I don't think we're free in America. I think we are burdened by our history of racial inequality. We have a history of horrific mistreatment of people based on color. And I think that narrative of racial difference that was cultivated to justify that mistreatment has created a kind of smog, and we all have been breathing it in. If you read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about narratives of racial differences. It doesn't talk about ideologies of white supremacy. It only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. We had the decades of terrorism and violence where Black people were pulled out of their homes, burned alive, hung, beaten to death, sometimes literally on the courthouse lawn. And we've never talked about this. And then we had this era of civil rights resistance to racial segregation. And we have made progress, but we haven't confronted the narrative of racial difference. Unlike South Africa, where you are required to hear about the damage done by apartheid. Unlike Germany. In Berlin, Germany, you can't go 100 meters without seeing markers or stones or monuments placed near the homes of Jewish families abducted during the Holocaust. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. And our silence has condemned us. When I went to Harvard Law School my first year, I didn't want people to know that I started my education at a colored school. I didn't want them to know that I was the great grandson of enslaved people. I thought it might diminish me. And then I realized that my power, if I have any, my strength, if I have any, my insight, if I have any, was shaped by those people who survived slavery. And it's that story of survival that I think we have some we have some greatness that we can offer, and not just people of color, but all of us who've learned to overcome.
Thank you, David. Once a month, our congregation donates our offering to a local organization that shares our values. Today, that organization is Suscol Intertribal Council. Suscol Intertribal Council's mission is to develop and maintain a Native American Suscol house in Chile's Pope Valley in Napa County. The land project is a sustainable open space that will serve as a prototype to preserve and protect Native American culture and traditions. The land was purchased in 1998. Construction on the Suscol house began in the summer of 2018, and last year the walls and roof were added. Suscol Intertribal Council is working to create healing between Indigenous populations and current residents of this region. They are committed to promotion of cultural exchanges and communication between Indigenous peoples and the general public. All cash and check donations in the plate will be sent to our Share the Plate recipient, unless the check is marked as pledge. So if it is a pledge check, write pledge in the memo line. Otherwise, it's going to the Suscol Intertribal Council. But make your check out to NVUU. And people online can donate by going to the donate button. And again, if it's not marked pledge, it will go to the Suscol Intertribal Council. The offering will now be gratefully received.